There are two BLs in recent memory that I loved a lot, that I really enjoyed, but ended up walking away with really bitter feelings. One of them being the only one that aired, I believe, last year, and man, what is time? And then this year, the obvious massive hit that is Revenge Love. I want to just talk about these two series and talk about some of my disappointments with Revenge Love and what kind of left a sour, bitter taste in my mouth, but also what was really triumphant about the show and why I think it's such a huge cultural phenomenon right now in like the BL space. Hi, I'm Monique. I am the host of Off by Purple Art podcast, where I talk to you about K-dramas, C-dramas, and BTS, and so much more. BLs in particular have been a huge focus of my podcast of late because, just to be honest, that's what I've been watching a lot, and BL is a huge subgenre of romance, and it can be in Chinese dramas, it could be a Korean drama, it just like multifaceted. I recently talked about Revenge Love. I did like a little bit of a summer BL watch list podcast. That was probably my most recent episode. You can definitely go back and watch that. And I talked a lot about Revenge Love and just the entire whirlwind that it has been since its airing. It's since completed at the time of me filming it. It does leave a little bit of bitter taste in my mouth for several reasons. One, I think it's just really well done, and the chemistry, especially through episodes 1 and 14, was fire. I think the actors, both Ziyu and Tien, they did such a great job. And Sue and Chi Chang, their relationship, their toxic back and forth, all the scheming amongst the two of them, I think they were equally yoked and equally matched as far as their wits. And the show really didn't take itself seriously in tone. Yeah, it had a lot of problematic elements. I'm sure it doesn't even scratch the surface of how the book was. I haven't read the book. I probably won't, to be honest, but I will get into my disappointments with the show. But I think with Revenge Love in particular, I really enjoyed their push and pull. The chemistry was there, and even though this show got super viral super early, you still got the sense that they were telling the story that they wanted to tell, particularly when everything kind of came to a head and the two of them got together. By the way, this is probably going to go to spoilers, so obviously if you're watching this, you're okay with being spoiled. I'm assuming you've watched the entirety of the series. And I really enjoyed that interplay a lot. I think episode 11 is probably like my favorite of the series, and then maybe episode 20 for entirely different reasons, but I'll get into that. I think from episode 14 and up is when we could start to see the problems. There was that time period where the show went off air and there was some scrambling behind the scenes, and they reassured the audience that, hey, we're just kind of editing things, just making sure that we just smooth over some bump, but don't worry, we're not cutting out anything major. And that's when everyone started panicking, and they're like, oh God, is this going to be another addicted situation? Are we going to get to finish watching this BL? And that was at the time where the actors were really getting popular, were trending daily on Weibo. They're probably still trending up until now as I'm filming this. And they were getting harassed in the airplanes, couldn't even take just a simple commercial flight without fans getting real weird in their face, making them cry and all sorts of crazy shit. And the show kind of went dark for a few days and then came back, and then things started to get really jarring. I think one of the few things I could say that was a little bit disappointing to me heading towards the second half and the final episodes of Revenge Love was the entire introduction of Wangshu. And I understand that him being an ex and his mental health issues and his kind of toxic throuple situation, but not really throuple situation, interplayed with how insecure he felt, and he was very much a wounded character, and I think his character arc was necessary for the advancement of for Chi Chang and for Sue, but I think his arc lasted a bit too long, and I think it got to a point where it was just, the miscommunication was really getting out of hand. But they had 24 episodes, so I figured there was going to be some bumps on the road. But another big problem was just the tampering of the intimacy. I know there was a lot of behind the scenes stuff with the show, and I think one of the main things was because the two leads were getting so popular and they want to continue to be able to coexist and get acting jobs in mainland China and not have to contend with being blackballed from the industry altogether, even though this show was very carefully crafted so that it wouldn't be triggering any alarm bells from the government, and it was produced outside of mainland China. I just feel like the intimacy was cut down so much, it was to the detriment of the show. Definitely with the reconciliation of these two characters, with everything, all the machinations that were at play with Wang Shu and his entire descent into madness, the whole push and pull, everything, it was just the heat and the intense chemistry basically being doused out with water. And not that I expected like super over the top heavy NC. If you're familiar with me at all and my podcast, especially when I talk about like intimacy in scenes, I'm not necessarily looking for like heavy petting and stuff like that. I'm looking for the true romance. I'm looking for true connection between the characters. I felt even that was tampered out a lot. Mind you, narratively, towards the second half, later episodes, and episode 20, which I really enjoyed, we saw the entire arc of Sue's mom and her eventual decline in health, and then that really gut-crushing scene where you got to see some of the best work from Zhu in the show, and the grief that he was able to play, and the fact that he wouldn't be able to be the son that could marry and have that traditional quote-unquote family structure. But I think the acting was phenomenal in that. So I could understand the weight of the passing of his mom, but there was like cuts that were really head scratching to me. Like, for example, we didn't even get to see, Chi Chang visit the gravesite of the parents along with Sue, and he built such a relationship with the mom too. And I feel like that's a really horrible cut to make. Reconciling after being thrown into prison, everything with the dad, not even so much as like a kiss on the forehead. And just, even though we got to see them hug and we got to see a little bit of that intimacy, I feel like they doused so much ice bucket water on that beautiful scorching tension, which is, I think, one of the primary reasons why we all fell in love with this show to begin with. Is really disappointing, and it reminds me so much of like my disappointment with On1y. Now, the On1y is a little bit of a different circumstance. The On1y was a Taiwanese production through and through, and it wasn't that we got episodes cut out or anything like that because of the overwhelming popularity of the actors. But I do remember one of the main actors, Eric, he plays Sheng Wang in the On1y, and he's a recognizable actor that has been in like huge mainland China popular C-dramas. Only for Love, yes, and I've been very high-key shady towards that show, but he's an actor that appears in that. And I remember the bitterness I felt when we heard that we were not going to get a season 2 of this show, and the actors themselves were kind of getting some heat as well. And because, as I said, one of them is a pretty recognizable actor in a lot of big Chinese productions, like his career was at risk as well. And I remember just how sorely bitter I was, and that level of crushing disappointment when we finally got the news that we weren't getting a season 2, mainly because it was just a lot of production stuff behind the scenes that weren't working out. The funding wasn't there, and historically BLs have a really hard time getting the money, getting the resources in play, and then you deal with another factor as far as censorship boards and having the rigorous process that a lot of these dramas coming out of China or coming out of Taiwan, like there's just a lot going on, and it just reminds me of that disappointment in that. But man, when Revenge Love was good, Revenge Love was good. I still think of Revenge Love highly as far as this year in 2025 as one of my more favorite dramas, and it'll probably be high up there, but it probably will not be number one because, as much as I liked it, and I have a lot of fond memories, as I said, like the first 14 episodes, absolutely the chemistry was fire. And even though there were single moments in the later half of the show, definitely the entire arc with the mom, which I've highlighted in my previous podcast, there was just too much stuff that felt super sloppy in the editing process, and we end up losing so much. And it's so sad to me because yes, you want typically the shows that you watch to get successful, but the success of the show was such a double-edged sword that even though with the success, it came with so much backlash to the point where had the show stayed under the radar and had become like a cult classic over the years, we might have been able to have gotten the show completely unedited in its true nature and truly get to see the passion between these two main characters who barely could keep their hands off each other and and not being able to like look away from each other, like the super heat from their gazes, and just the level of intimacy that we did get, which was shocking for like a Chinese BL, so to speak. And then to see what the second half turned into, where you're constantly on tender hooks and wondering if the show was just going to suddenly get yanked from the air, even though they went through all these provisions to ensure that the show was sold to international platforms so we could get all 24 episodes. This show had so much chaotic energy, but it was good chaotic energy, and I felt like it gave a much needed adrenaline rush to the BL genre. Like, it to me felt very stale this year, and there's a lot of big productions that for me personally felt really flat on their faces. And while I still enjoyed Revenge Love a lot, I do come away with a little bit of disappointment now that the afterglow has started to fade a little bit and I can take more of a step back, and it just reminds me of how crushed I felt about The Only One and how that ended. So just let me know your thoughts. What did you think about the finale of Revenge Love? Did you feel satisfied? I can say at the very least, at least we got all 24 episodes, because I was really scared that the show was going to get fully yanked, even though all the provisions were being in place. Did you really feel like a lot of the editing did a disservice to the show, that they cut away too much to the point where it was at the detriment of the storytelling of the show? Are you someone also that is a fan of The Only One, disappointed as I am, and feel a similar crushing weight that we no longer got to see in season 2? Even though the reasons why I feel bitter about that are entirely different from Revenge Love, it just reminds me of the same kind of melancholy and sadness I feel. Let me know your thoughts. If you're watching via YouTube, definitely in the comment section below. I try to answer as best as I can. If you're watching or listening via Spotify or Apple Podcasts, let me know your thoughts as well. I'm always curious. And until the next episode,